When I tell people I used to be a paranormal investigator, one of two things usually happens. Either the person I'm telling pretty much laughs in my face and scoffs at the idea of ghosts, or the person wants to hear more, and oftentimes asks me, "What was the scariest thing that ever happened to you?" I started hunting ghosts when I was a teenager. I remember from a young age, sitting with my mother in the living room while she watched a man on TV ramble on and on about how he was connected to the afterlife, that he could speak with ghosts, and give people closure from the dearly departed. My mother, of course, would laugh and call it all a load of crap, but my child-sized mind would hang on to every word this man said as if he were communing with the spirits of another world. Eventually, I would grow to realize that, yeah, my mother was right. The man was a fraud, like most of the people who did that sort of thing for publicity. I'm not discounting all psychics or mediums, but I think the ones that do a flashy performance on television are pretty much all talk. Even though the performance was fake, the idea of communicating with the dead was something that appealed to me. It wasn't fully cemented in my life, however, until I watched a man on TV look into a camera and say these words. "Behind me is supposedly the most haunted house in the world. I'm here to find out the truth." Upon saying this, the man entered the dilapidated house behind him and began his investigation. I was utterly captivated by this. I had heard that people would hunt for ghosts, but to see it on actual television was something else entirely. The man proceeded to walk throughout the house, asking questions into the darkness with nothing but a camera and a tape recorder. Sometimes, upon asking a question, a faint noise throughout the house would resonate as if the house itself were a living creature. The next half hour was filled with the man going from room to room asking questions, and nervously glancing at the camera. At the end of the episode, they played back some of the audio they recorded, and the faintest of voices could be heard responding to the man's questions. The chills that went down my spine upon hearing these responses was otherworldly. I knew, at that moment, this was something I wanted to do, just like the man on television. So I did my research. I finished high school. I joined websites and vlogging groups, until I finally earned a place amongst a fairly well-known ghost hunting crew. While we weren't on national television, we did have one of the largest paranormal websites on the internet. For a while, the crew and I would go to mediocre locations near our home studio. A lot of the time, we wouldn't find so much as a cool breeze. Oh, by the way, I hate to break it to you guys, but a lot of those paranormal TV shows are fake as well. You really think that they go to these places and something happens every single time? It doesn't. A lot of the time, you simply waste days sitting in an uneventful house without anything to show for it. But of course, TV is TV, and if they want to doctor up some audio in post-production, even though they say it's unedited, to get a higher rating, they will do it. Now, once again, I'm not discrediting all ghost hunters or paranormal investigators. Usually, the investigators are really good hunters, with really good equipment. But the network bigwigs like to jazz things up to boost their numbers. That's the gist of how I became an investigator. Well, here's the part where I stopped being an investigator. It was early October a few years back when my crew received a tip about a supposedly haunted house in the next state over. We received hundreds of tips every day about go here and check this out. But something about this tip seemed strange. The subject of the email just had a single word: haunted. It may seem childish, but something about reading this solitary word for the email subject almost made me feel like the person sending this had zero doubt that this location was in fact haunted. So I opened the email and read a little bit. The house itself wasn't a very famous haunted house, but it wasn't just a random unknown one either. I had read several other reports regarding this house in the past since it was fairly close to our home studio. Now, how my crew actually handled tips and investigations was a bit odd. The crew was fairly large, and at the risk of wasting time and manpower chasing rumors, we would usually send one investigator and an intern. The team would go scope out the area, sometimes conduct an impromptu investigation on site, then return and determine if it's even worth the time. After taking a vote on who would go this time, I was selected to investigate the location, with the aid of one of our interns. That weekend, the intern and I loaded up my car and we headed out. The intern, John, was a quiet kid, though from his outward appearance it would seem to be the opposite. He was what some people would consider a goth. You would think his reason for joining our crew was to worship the underworld masters, but he confided in me that he always enjoyed creepy things, and that made him somewhat of an outcast in social circles. I was shocked when he spoke to me, because even though his outward appearance was aggressive, he was very soft-spoken and polite. When we arrived at the location, my first impression of the house was not very good. It was an average farmhouse in the middle of a desolate wasteland that was once probably a very successful farm. The rumors that circulated the house ranged from a maniac slaughtering the entire family one night, to the daughter losing her mind and murdering her parents. Everything was mostly hearsay, as one day the farm was prosperous. Then the following it was left abandoned. John and I entered through the front door, which barely clung to its hinges. As we stepped inside, the smell of rotting wood and dust filled the air. The light from the sun was rapidly leaving the sky as John and I prepared to do our investigation. He handed me a camera and a tape recorder as I began to meander around the house. The fascinating part about being a paranormal investigator is that you get to experience a lot of history. Even though it was just an old farmhouse, I could instantly tell that this house carried with it a lot of memories. As the sun finally set, I asked John which he would rather investigate first, the attic or the basement. His response was a shrug, as he really didn't mind either. I asked if he wouldn't mind checking out the basement while I searched the attic. It's not that I was scared of the basement, I just didn't want to spend the night sitting in an old abandoned basement, that is. He nodded and made his way towards the steps as I made my way to the second floor. As I began traversing from room to room, I asked the occasional question. Is anyone here? What is your name? How old are you? What happened to you? By this point, I had already reached the ladder up to the attic. The attic itself was very underwhelming. A couple of empty wooden boxes, a small chair turned on its side, and a tiny window in the wall. I pulled up the chair and sat down, taking a rest for a bit. While I sat there, I could feel an uneasiness begin to set in. Sometimes when you encounter a spirit, you can feel strange emotions. Well, the feeling I started getting as I sat alone in the darkness was panic. I was feeling like I needed to leave that place immediately. So I got up and I quickly descended the ladder, then the stairs. When I made it to the ground floor, I called out to John. He didn't answer. I called out once again, loudly this time, as I made my way through the kitchen. Still nothing. When I got to the basement door, I called out one last time. Just as I did, the door to the basement slammed in my face. This jolted me, causing me to run all the way out of the house and back to my car. When I was safely in my car, I quickly dialed 911. The police told me that it would take some time to send a unit out to me, but to just sit and wait for them to arrive. When they hung up, I was left in the silence of my car as the color slowly started returning to my face. Just then, I realized I was gripping the tape recorder in my other hand so tightly that I could hear the plastic starting to creak under the pressure. I rewinded the tape and played it back. My voice crackled through the little speaker. Is anyone here? Just then, I heard something. It was faint, barely above a whisper. I had to place my ear directly next to the little box to hear it. Yes. What is your name? John. How old are you? 17. What happened to you? Killed in the basement. Hearing this exchange, The little bit of color that had returned to my face faded once again. Confusion, panic, and fear coursed through me. As I sat there, I heard something else on the recorder. The voice said something at the same time I felt that feeling of panic up in the attic.
Get out. It knows you're here.
I could then hear myself calling out to John, and as I approached the basement, I heard the word,
Don't.
before the basement door slammed in my face. Just then, the police arrived and I explained everything to them. They, of course, searched the entire building from top to bottom, but found no evidence to support my claim. They said the basement was cluttered, but there was no sign of my intern. They took my statement and let me know that they would keep an eye on the area in case John turned up. But somehow I knew that he wouldn't. The next morning, I made my way back home. When I entered the office, I told the rest of the crew what had happened and gave them my recording. I quit immediately after that. As I was leaving the office, I gave them all a final warning. Never go to that house. You may never make it out again. If you do.